14 people were sitting around that boardroom table, and not one of them made a sound. My director was standing at the head of the room, arms crossed, waiting for me to break. His son was sitting 2 seats to my left, not looking at me, and I had my phone in my jacket pocket with an audio file that was 42 minutes long. I want to back up, because to understand what happened in that room, you have to understand how I got there. I spent 6 years with the Canadian Armed Forces Royal Canadian Engineers, working on infrastructure and equipment that other people's lives depended on. When I left the service in my early 30s, I took a job with a mid-sized aerospace components manufacturer outside of Winnipeg, a company called Meridian Structural Systems. They supplied parts to both civilian aviation and defense contractors. Not glamorous work, but honest work. Work that mattered. I started on the shop floor. Quality assurance mostly. Checking tolerances, signing off on components, making sure what we shipped matched what we promised. After 4 years, I moved into a senior technical compliance role. I knew the specs for every major contract we held. I knew the suppliers. I knew the process. The people who'd been there longer than me knew that if I signed off on something, it was right. That meant something to me. My director, the man I reported to, was a guy named Robert. He'd been with Meridian for over 20 years. Smart guy. Good instincts mostly. Robert had a son, Callum, who'd just finished a business degree at the University of Manitoba. Callum was 26. He'd done a 4-month co-op with a marketing firm and one summer helping his uncle flip houses. That was the sum of his professional experience. In the spring, Robert announced that Callum was joining the company as a project coordinator on our largest active contract, a federal procurement deal with the Department of National Defense worth roughly $180 million over 3 years. The contract covered structural components for a new class of military transport vehicles. The specs were written by D&D engineers and they were not suggestions. Every dimension, every material grade, every load tolerance existed because someone had calculated exactly what was needed to keep people alive in the field. I didn't say anything when Callum was brought on. I introduced myself, showed him around, answered his questions. He was polite enough, a bit eager in the way people are when they know they got the job through their father, but are trying to pretend they didn't. I've seen it before. I've seen it since. You learn not to resent the kid for something that isn't entirely his fault. What became his fault was what came next. About 3 months into the contract, our primary supplier for a specific grade of hardened steel sheeting used in the vehicle floor panels flagged a delivery delay. The supplier was based in Hamilton, Ontario, and they were dealing with a furnace issue that was going to push our shipment by 6 weeks. That was a problem. Our contract had penalty clauses for timeline violations that could run into the hundreds of thousands. Robert asked Callum to lead the cost mitigation analysis, find options, report back. Callum came back 2 weeks later with a proposal to source a substitute material from an alternative supplier in Quebec at a significantly lower price point. He presented it to Robert with a slide deck, charts, cost comparisons, projected savings. It looked thorough. What it did not include was a materials compliance analysis. I flagged it in the meeting. I said we needed to verify that the substitute material met the D&D specifications before we could consider it as an option. Callum looked at me the way young people sometimes look at older people who are slowing them down. Robert said we'd look into it. They didn't loop me in on the follow-up. 4 weeks later, I noticed a change order in our procurement system. The substitute material had been approved internally, and the order had been placed. The substitution had gone through without a formal compliance review. No engineering sign-off, no spec comparison on file. Just Robert's signature and a note that said the supplier had provided equivalent grade documentation. I pulled the supplier's documentation. I read it twice. Then I read our D&D contract specifications. The substitute material had a lower yield strength rating. Not by much, about 8%. But in military applications, 8% is not a rounding error. It's a threshold. The D&D spec existed for a reason. I brought it to Robert directly. I put both documents on his desk side by side and walked him through the discrepancy. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said that the supplier had assured him the material would perform adequately in field conditions. I told him that assurance from a supplier was not the same as compliance with a federal defense contract. He told me I was being rigid. That word specifically, rigid. I asked him if he had documentation that supported a formal deviation from the spec. He said the deviation hadn't been formally filed. I asked him how we were going to explain that to D&D if they audited the shipment. He told me he would handle it and that my job was to keep the line running. I went back to my office and I sat there for about 20 minutes. Then I opened my desk drawer and I took out the small digital recorder I'd started keeping since the previous fall, when a different disagreement with Robert had somehow become my disagreement on paper, even though the decision had been entirely his. I had learned something from that situation. I started keeping notes. I started keeping records. Nothing illegal. Nothing covert. Just the habit of documentation that my time in the military had actually taught me and that I had let slip in civilian life. Over the next several weeks, I documented everything. I kept copies of the original spec sheets and the supplier's documentation. I logged every conversation with Robert about the substitution. When he told me verbally to sign off on an inspection report for the first shipment of substitute components, I asked him to send me that instruction in writing. He did, because he didn't think I was building a record. He thought I was just being thorough. The components shipped. 3 separate deliveries over 6 weeks. In September, we got notice of a federal compliance audit scheduled for November. D&D was sending a team to review documentation and inspect components across several active contracts, including ours. Standard procedure for contracts of this size. I had been through 2 of them before. They were serious, methodical, and not the kind of thing you walked into with substituted materials and no deviation filings on record. I went to Robert's office and closed the door. I told him we had a serious problem. I told him the audit team would pull material certifications and cross-reference them against contract specs. I told him we had 3 shipments of non-compliant components already delivered and no approved deviation on file. I told him we needed to either disclose proactively to D&D and file a corrective action report, or we were looking at a potential contract violation, finding that could involve penalties, contract termination, and possibly procurement fraud charges under the Financial Administration Act. He looked at me and said, "Nathan, you worry too much." I said, "Robert, I need you to understand what I'm telling you." He said he would speak to legal. He said I should focus on preparing my own documentation for the audit and leave the big picture to him. He said it in the tone people use when they're done listening. 2 weeks before the audit, Callum came to find me at my workstation. He looked nervous. He said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Sure." He sat down and asked me what would happen at the audit if they found the material substitution. I told him honestly. I said they would likely find it. I said the consequences would depend on what documentation existed and what had been disclosed. He asked if there was anything I could do to help things go smoothly. I asked him what he meant by that. He said maybe I didn't need to volunteer the material comparison if they didn't specifically ask. Maybe I could focus on what was compliant. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Callum, I can't do that, and I wouldn't do that." He left looking worse than when he arrived. That evening, I stayed late. I organized my personal documentation file. I made sure I had copies of everything: the original contract specs, the supplier's documentation, the change order, Robert's email instruction to me, the inspection reports, the shipping records. I put it all on an encrypted USB drive that I took home. The following Monday, Robert called me into a meeting that he said was about audit preparation. When I walked in, Callum was sitting there too, and the head of HR, a woman named Patricia, who I had always gotten along with and who looked deeply uncomfortable. Robert told me that it had come to his attention that I had been creating a negative environment around the audit process, that I had been discouraging team members from focusing on our genuine strengths. He said that Callum had found my recent behavior demoralizing and that my attitude was affecting morale in the run-up to an important review period. Then he said he needed me to apologize to Callum in that room for the way I had made him feel in our recent interactions. I want to tell you what that felt like for a second, because I think it matters. I had done nothing wrong. I had done everything right. I had flagged a compliance issue through the correct channels. I had documented everything properly. And I was sitting in a room being asked to apologize to the 26-year-old son of my director, who had signed off on a materials fraud and then asked me to help cover it up because he found me demoralizing. I was 51 years old. I had served my country. I had spent 20 years in technical work earning the right to sign my name on documents, and someone was asking me to apologize for doing exactly what my signature was supposed to guarantee. I said, "Before I respond to that, I'd like to share something with everyone in this room." Robert said, "Nathan, I don't think this is the time to." I took out my phone. I opened the audio file. I connected it to the small Bluetooth speaker on the boardroom table that we used for conference calls. I pressed play. The first voice was mine, clear and calm. The second was Robert's. The conversation was from 3 weeks earlier, the one where I had told him we had a compliance problem and he had told me to focus on my documentation and leave the big picture to him. You could hear every word. You could hear when I explained the Financial Administration Act implications. You could hear when he said he would speak to legal. You could hear, clearly, his instruction to me to proceed with my portion of the audit preparation without raising the substitution issue proactively. Then there was a second clip, Callum's voice, asking me if I could help things go smoothly. My voice asking him what he meant. His answer. I let it play until Robert said, "Stop." I stopped it. Patricia from HR was writing on her notepad. She had not stopped writing since about 30 seconds into the first clip. Robert's face had gone through about 4 different expressions. He settled on something that looked like controlled anger, which I understood was actually fear, wearing a different coat. Callum did not look at me. I said, "I'm not going to apologize. What I am going to do is submit a formal disclosure to the D&D procurement office and file a corrective action report. I'll have it ready by end of day Thursday. I'm happy to walk anyone in this room through the documentation I have on file." I stood up. I walked out. My heart was going about twice its normal speed, and I was grateful my voice had stayed even. I filed the corrective action report on Thursday, as I had said I would. I sent it to D&D's Procurement Compliance Office in Ottawa and copied our company's legal counsel and the CEO, who I had not previously spoken to about any of this and who called me personally about 2 hours after receiving the email. That conversation was the longest phone call I had at work in 20 years. The audit happened as scheduled in November. The D&D team spent 3 days on site. They pulled every document I had listed in the corrective action report. They examined the components in storage. They interviewed multiple staff members, including me, Robert, and Callum separately. I brought my personal documentation file to my interview and provided copies of everything I had. The audit findings came back in December. The company was issued a formal notice of non-compliance. The 3 shipments of substitute components were quarantined and are in the process of being replaced at the company's cost, a figure I was told would be in the range of $2.5 million when you factored in the rework, the replacement materials, and the contract penalties. Robert was placed on administrative leave 2 days after the audit findings were issued. He resigned before the new year. His legal situation is, as far as I know, still ongoing. What I can tell you is that procurement fraud under a federal defense contract in Canada is not a civil matter. The Crown takes it seriously. The Financial Administration Act exists for a reason. Callum was terminated. He was 26. I hope he learns something from this that serves him better than what his father modeled for him. Patricia from HR sent me a brief note in January that said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that she wanted me to know that what I had done took a kind of integrity that was rare, and that she was glad I had been there. That note meant more to me than she probably knew. I stayed. Of course I stayed. I have a mortgage in Winnipeg and a retirement fund that is slightly behind where I would like it to be, and a job I am genuinely good at. But also, and this matters more to me than I sometimes admit out loud, I stayed because the work matters. The people who use these components are not abstractions. They are in vehicles, on roads, in conditions that most of us will never experience. When I sign my name on something, it means the thing is what it says it is. I was not raised to be a difficult person. I was raised to be a reliable one. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to understand that defending the second sometimes looks exactly like the first. The audit team lead, a retired military engineer from the procurement office, shook my hand on the last day of the audit. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just nodded and said, "Good documentation. In that world, that's everything." I still think about the moment Robert said the word rigid, not because it hurt. It didn't, not really, but because of how casually he said it. Like doing your job carefully was a personality flaw. Like the 20 years I had spent making sure things were right was something to be managed around rather than valued. What happened to Robert and Callum wasn't bad luck. It was the natural end of a long chain of choices. Robert chose to sign off on a substitution he knew wasn't compliant. He chose not to file a deviation. He chose to tell me to stay in my lane. And when those choices started catching up to him, he chose to try to make the problem about me instead of about the material sitting in a D&D warehouse that didn't meet spec. Every step followed from the one before it. That's not fate. That's just cause and effect, playing out the way it always does when people start believing that shortcuts won't eventually surface. Callum is young enough that I genuinely hope he carries something useful out of this. What his father modeled for him was that position and connection could substitute for competence and integrity. What he got instead was a front row seat to exactly what happens when that turns out not to be true. I don't know what he does with that. But the lesson was there if he wants it. I've been in technical work long enough to know that the people who last, the ones who are still trusted at 50, still called when something critical needs a second set of eyes, are not necessarily the most brilliant people in the room. They're the ones who understood early that their name on a document means something. That being right isn't about ego. It's about the person on the other end of the work who never gets to meet you and is counting on you anyway. What I did wasn't brave in any dramatic sense. I kept records. I asked for instructions in writing. I filed a report when I said I would. That's not heroism. That's just the basic discipline of someone who takes the work seriously. The courage, if there was any, was smaller and quieter than it sounds in the retelling. It was the decision, made over and over across several months, not to look away from something I had already seen. Patricia's note meant something to me because she didn't have to send it. She was in that room. She saw what happened. And she took a minute out of her day to acknowledge it. That kind of thing. A small, deliberate act of decency doesn't cost much and lands harder than people expect. I'm still in Winnipeg, still doing the same work. The contract is still running with compliant materials now and a considerably smaller profit margin than Robert had projected. There's a kind of satisfaction in that which I don't feel the need to dress up in bigger words. Good documentation. That's what the audit team lead said when he shook my hand. I've been thinking about those two words ever since. They sound like a technical compliment, but what they actually mean is you paid attention, you told the truth, and you kept the receipts. As a way of moving through a career, through a life, honestly, I think you could do a lot worse.